Content warning. This video discusses historical sexual violence and institutional coercion. We will describe legal frameworks and archaeological evidence without graphic detail. Please take care watching. Picture this. It is 186 BCE. A domus glows with oil lamps and the murmur of guests. Music drifts down a marble stair. A father, proud and dutiful, watches his daughter step from the threshold into the night. She wears a heavy veil. Her hair is bound. Her hands are offered in ritual to a husband and to the gods. For everyone present, it is the end of one life and the start of another. For the girl beneath that veil, something else awaits, something neither her father nor the guests talk about afterward. In the dark below a temple, behind a locked door, there is a small stone chamber whose walls will later receive the names of women whose voices have been mostly lost to us. This is the disturbing wedding ritual Rome didn't want you to know about. That is the central claim of this investigation. A set of ritual practices described in fragmentary legal texts, furtive literary allusions, and corroborated by archaeology that operated at the intersection of religion and law. These practices were framed as purification. They were protected by legal sanction. They were surrounded by silence, enforced by social and juridical penalties. And they left traces, in stone, in paint, in scratched names, that we can now begin to read. The question is not whether every marriage in ancient Rome involved violence. The question is how a legal religious system made certain procedures possible, how silence was built into tradition, and how survivors, in small and courageous acts, left signs that pull at the edges of the official story. Before we go further, what follows must be understood as interpretive reconstruction. The evidence is fragmentary. Some names and spellings in older reports are uncertain. Where claims depend on contested sources, I will say so. Archaeologists and historians have not reached a single unanimous verdict. Instead, a growing body of work over the last 2 decades argues that the ritualized access to brides was real, structurally embedded, and sometimes protected by law. We will follow those fragments, weigh the material remains, and listen for the names on the wall. Act 1. The law that made ritual. To understand how a ritual could be both sacred and coercive, we must start with Roman law. In Rome, marriage was not only a private arrangement, it was a legal transfer. A daughter moved from the authority of her father into the authority of her husband, a transfer known as manus. Manus was not a mere formality. It placed a woman into a new legal status in which her person, her property, and often her autonomy were redefined within a patriarchal legal framework. Within that framework, certain words reappear in the legal vocabulary: purification, consecration, rites of entrance.
The earliest surviving legal fragments, later commentators referencing the 12 Tables and other archaic laws, preserve the language of ritual purification attached to the joining of bride and groom. Those texts, however, come to us through layers of later interpretation. They do not spell out actions in modern forensic terms. Instead, they frame certain rites as necessary in order for a marriage to be lawful and complete, a godly seal on a social transaction. Why might a legal system insist that a bride undergo a religious rite? Scholars suggest several possibilities. A rite could serve to legitimate the marriage in the eyes of a community. It could symbolically transfer the woman's person into the custody of a new household. It might perform, in public and sacred form, the absorption of an individual into a civil order. But where the law speaks of purification, it also creates power, and power is never neutral. When priests stood as custodians of sacred procedure, their authority could be used to shield actions within ritualese from secular scrutiny. The paradox is striking. The law, which ordinarily provides public remedies and categories of accountability, appears here to have carved out a religious exception. In some fragmentary statutes and later legal commentaries, acts performed under the rubric of sacred ritual carried protections. Exposure of sacred rites could be punished as impiety. Revealing what transpired within the sanctuary could itself become a crime. That legal insulation, paired with the social expectation that women remain modest, mute, and veiled, created a zone in which violence could be performed without the full force of public redress. At the margins of these legal texts, we also find shards of procedure that scholars use to reconstruct the practice. A requirement that a priest perform a purification at marriage. A note that some rites involve the bride being handed over to divine custody. Language about the veil and about the bride entering a closed space. Each line is partial. Each line invites interpretation. Taken together and compared with other kinds of evidence, they sketch how religious authority and legal sanction teamed up to make certain practices both ritual and regulated. If you want more investigations into buried histories like this, consider subscribing. Act 2. The Chamber Beneath the Temple. If law provides the frame, archaeology provides a body. Beginning in the early 21st century, excavations on the Aventine Hill and at other temple sites have revealed a set of subterranean spaces that complicate the traditional picture of Roman domestic rites. These are not large underground catacombs. They are small, carefully constructed chambers beneath sanctuaries and shrines, flagstone beds, shallow troughs carved into the stone, drainage channels, doors with latching mechanisms, and in several cases, graffiti or inscriptions scratched into the walls.
The Aventine excavation of 2003 is often cited as a turning point. Archaeologists working in the layers beneath a small temple complex reported a room measuring just a few meters across, with a stone slab arranged like a bed against one wall, a narrow channel running downhill from a basin, and a heavy door frame that showed signs of repeated use. Near the slab, excavators found faint incised letters. Those markings were not monumental inscriptions. They were small, personal, the kind of marks someone might make in a private space. Several of those marks later were read as female names: Julia, Cornelia, Flavia, Fulvia, each followed in some cases by a short notation that could plausibly indicate a date or a reference to a marriage ritual. I will note that some of the readings are contested in the scholarship. Letter forms wear away, and catalogers have disagreed about exact spellings. Where I cite names, they should be understood as interpretive readings of worn inscriptions. What does this material assemblage suggest? Stone surfaces worn in places where a body would have been placed, drainage channels that could carry fluids away from a closed space, a lockable door that could make a room private even during a public ceremony, small, intimate marks carved into the stone by hands that had reason to leave a name on that wall. None of these features prove a single practice beyond doubt, but in combination with fragmentary textual hints, they make the hypothesis plausible that brides were brought into subterranean rooms as part of a purification rite, that certain acts occurred that later commentators either censored or encoded in euphemism, and that survivors sometimes left their names in the embrace of stone. Catherine John, whose excavation reports and subsequent articles have been central to the contemporary conversation, described these rooms not as places of habitual debauchery, but as architectural spaces that enabled private, ritually sanctioned encounters. Her careful descriptions emphasize the physical facts: bed-like slabs, dedicated drainage, and sealed thresholds. She stops short of claiming a single uniform practice across the city. Other scholars have sought to correlate these chambers with specific cults, Bona Dea, other local female deity cults, while some argue for a more generalized ritual function linked to marriage rites. The point for our reconstruction is not certainty, but likelihood. The combination of architecture and context is suggestive, and when read alongside legal vocabulary, it produces a coherent, if troubling, picture. Material traces beyond stone walls strengthen the case. In other houses and sanctuaries, we find wall paintings that seem to refuse the official silence. A fresco from a private house outside Pompeii, itself a later preserve, depicts a veiled woman with a small shadowed figure behind a curtain, rendered in a way that some archaeologists interpret as a visual complaint, the private artist refusing the public script. Again, interpretation is contentious, but the persistence of imagery that evacuates the celebratory veneer of marriage and suggests private sorrow or concealment is a signal worth attending to. Act 3. Fragments, pages, and the law of silence. If the law creates the terrain and the archaeology supplies the body, literature gives us the voice, or in many cases, the silences. Much of Roman literature is performative and public. Playwrights, satirists, and moralists rarely describe sacred rites in full. When they touch on such matters, it is often in censored hints, in jammed epigrams, or satirical asides. Surviving fragments, later citations, and medical writings offer a patchwork of testimony. A number of fragmentary theatrical texts seem to allude to forced or enforced access to brides under the cover of ritual. The plays survive only in snippets quoted by later grammarians or carved into marginalia. Their implications are often ambiguous. Similarly, medical writers of the imperial era record observations about women who present after marriage with injuries or signs of trauma. One medical author, transcribed in earlier sources as Serranus in some editions, though scholars debate the exact spelling and identity, notes that in some communities, a bride's veil concealed signs of recent hurt, and that physicians assessing marital issues found it difficult to obtain testimony because the ritual context forbade inquiry. Literary satirists also appear. Juvenal, his name sometimes garbled in transcription as juvenile, offers barbed lines about the poor who cannot afford alternative ceremonies. He suggests that where money lacks, amateurs improvise ritual forms that exploit young women. Satire is not a court of law. It is performative moral outrage, sometimes exaggerated for effect. But such sharp lines are valuable because they reflect contemporary anxieties about bodies, about virtue, about moneyed exceptions to ritual obligations. One fragment deserves particular attention because it speaks directly to the social mechanics of silence. Roman law could treat exposure of a sacred rite as impiety. The Lex Voconia and related statutes, originally designed to regulate wills and property rights, were later invoked to justify penalties against those who revealed mysteries. If an act happened under the auspices of a sacred ritual, to speak of it openly could be to transgress a legal boundary. Those who tried to force testimony or expose a priest's conduct risked being branded impious, and impiety carried social and sometimes legal penalties. This is crucial. Silence was not simply a social convention.
It was embedded in a legal, religious framework that could directly and indirectly punish disclosure. That is one reason why the documentary record is so thin. The very laws and customs governing the rites made it risky to speak. Act 4. The Veil, Class, and the Business of Avoidance. To see how these mechanisms played out in daily life, we must look at ritual garments and social workaround. The flamium, the bridal veil, is central to Roman iconography of marriage. It was a visible marker of transition, a texture of cloth that moved between public and private. But it also functioned to conceal. In literary testimony and in later legal commentary, the veil appears as a literal and symbolic means of hiding marks, wounds, or other evidence. A physician noting injuries after marriage might find the veil obstructing examination. A husband, bound by custom and by the sanctions against impiety, might hesitate to unfasten it in public. The effect is that certain forms of visible harm could be obscured, normalized, and left unexamined. Not everyone experienced this system in the same way. Wealth and connections produced workarounds. Several Roman sources hint that the affluent could substitute a symbolic ritual, an offering, a payment, a staged purification, in place of the subterranean procedure. Bribery, patronage, and legal influence could secure an alternative that protected the body while satisfying the gods. This is not speculation alone. Both legal records and satirical literature imply that elites had means to avoid particular obligations that the poor could not afford. The class dimension is important because it reframes the narrative away from a single, undifferentiated cultural practice. It shows how the same legal religious structure could protect certain interests and expose others. For elites, participation in official rites was often performative and controlled. For the less privileged, the ritual could be experienced as compulsory and dangerous. Juvenal's lampooning lines about the plebs reveal a bitter undertow. Ritual privilege is unevenly distributed. Act 5. When a system stumbles. Testimony, exile, and graffiti. Systems that rely on silence eventually encounter resistance. In the record, we find a few acts of courage that pierced the official hush. Scholars point to an episode in 186 BCE in which a woman, in some later reports called Hispalaficia or a variant of that name, the spelling of early sources is contested, attempted to testify before the Senate about what she had endured. Her testimony encountered a legal apparatus unprepared to treat ritualized injury as a crime. Instead of a thorough public reckoning, the Senate treated the episode as a matter of sacred governance. The outcome, according to later analysts, was bleak for the testifier. Exile, marginalization, or silence imposed upon her by the same laws that had once shielded ritual disclosure. This was not an isolated occurrence of suppression.
When senators did investigate religious excess, famously in the Bacchanalia affair, the response was selective. The Bacchanalia scandal of 1860 BCE is itself complex and often instrumentalized in political discourse of the time. Yet the contrast between the Senate's harsh response to the Bacchanalia and its more circumscribed handling of complaints about certain marriage rites is telling. It suggests a hierarchy of sacred crimes. Some cultic excesses were politicized and punished, while others were tolerated or regulated in ways that protected elite prerogatives.
If official institutions closed their doors, private acts of resistance kept a different account. In the Forum and in the alleys of the city, graffiti appears in the archaeological record, crude, urgent lines scratched into plaster. One piece of graffiti, found on a wall near a market thoroughfare, reads in rough terms, "Tradition hides what men call law." That is not a verbatim ancient inscription I can present as an exact translation. Instead, I summarize the sentiment recorded in several small anonymous scrawls that archaeologists have catalogued. People used walls to complain, to name names, to undermine the official story. In Pompeii, a fresco hidden in a private house, painted on a wall that was later plastered over and preserved by the ash of Vesuvius, depicts a veiled figure whose posture and shadowing suggest a narrative of shame or isolation rather than celebration. That fresco and the scratched names in subterranean rooms are the voices of the poor and the private, the names of women who, when the public legal system refused to hear them, left marks wherever they could. Historians have recovered occasional references to women who testified publicly, like the Hispalificia fragment, but these records are often marred by later editorializing. When a woman spoke, the machinery of law and custom usually pushed back: exile, branding, or being labeled impious. The cost of breaking silence was high. Yet the very existence of carved names and painted complaints tells us that silence was not consent. Modern reappraisal, from neglect to reconstruction. For centuries, historians of Rome either overlooked these fragments or read them through a lens of moralizing allegory. The narrative of grand men, offices, wars, and public monuments has long dominated Roman studies, leaving small, shameful corners unattended. Only within the last 20 years has a concerted interdisciplinary effort brought archaeologists, legal historians, and gender scholars into productive conversation. Excavations, careful analysis of wear patterns on stone, re-examination of legal glosses, and comparative study with Mediterranean ritual practices have made it possible to assemble a stronger case.
A 2018 synthetic study, presented in a forum of international scholars, argued that the convergence of legal texts, subterranean architecture, and fragmentary literature indicates a practiced, institutionalized series of rites that sometimes included sexual access by priests under the cover of purification. The study was careful to calibrate terms. It did not claim uniformity across Rome or across 3 centuries. It insisted on degrees of probability instead of rhetorical certainty. That caution is essential. But the study's larger contribution was to make visible what had been invisible: a pattern in which sacred language, legal protection, and architectural design tasked particular religious agents with authority over bodies at the threshold of marriage. This reappraisal has not been without controversy. Some historians urge restraint, asking whether modern categories of abuse and consent can be reliably mapped onto ancient practices. Others argue that the cumulative weight of material, textual, and contextual evidence tips the balance. Structures of ritualized access existed, and their effects can be traced in the bodies of sources and in the marks left by survivors. The scholarly debate is healthy, and it exemplifies methodology, weighing fragmentary evidence while acknowledging limits and avoiding overgeneralization. The evidence also reveals a pattern of decline. As the Republic transformed into empire, and as legal reforms accumulated, elite avoidance and symbolic purification became increasingly common. Where once a subterranean chamber might have been used, later generations substituted visible offerings, private vows, or payments. Ritual evolved, as rituals do, not simply by erasing the past, but by adapting to new social forms of power. The practice, if it existed in earlier centuries in more coercive forms, was mitigated among elites precisely because money and influence could buy alternatives. That, in turn, meant the poor bore a disproportionate burden. Names on the wall, survivors as testimony. We return finally to the carved names. In the cold light of the chamber, letters worn by centuries of breath still make suggestions. Julia, Cornelia, Flavia, Fulvia, readings that scholars have proposed with varying degrees of confidence. Each is a fragmentary claim imposed onto weathered stone. Each is also a human trace. To say Julia in this context is not to claim we know her life story. It is to say that someone with that name pressed a tool to the wall and made a mark. That act itself is a form of testimony. Survivors do not speak to us directly in most cases. They speak through the material record they could control. A scratched name, a fading fresco, a painted complaint in a marketplace. Those traces are neither the full truth of the past, nor a theatrical reveal. They are the remains of agency in an environment that often attempted to suppress it.
They are all we have when tribunals invoked religion and law invoked piety to shield male authority. Ethical reflections and contemporary resonances. What should a modern viewer take from this history? First, traditions can mask harm. When a practice is framed as sacred, it acquires a halo that can obscure power imbalances. When law insulates right from scrutiny, victims can be left without remedy. Second, systems change when social participation withdraws.
The evidence shows patterns of elite avoidance, symbolic rituals replacing embodied procedures, payments substituting for compulsion. That is a historical mechanism of reform by refusal, albeit one that rests on privilege. Third, recovery is ongoing work. It requires cross-disciplinary patience, archaeologists who read stone, historians who read law, literary scholars who decode fragments, and feminist scholars who insist on asking uncomfortable questions. It is tempting and easy to use this past as a mirror that confirms modern anxieties. Yet historical comparison demands nuance. We must not anachronistically project modern legal categories onto ancient actors. We must also not invent innocence where systems of power and religious authority produced asymmetric vulnerabilities. The middle path is to hold complexity, to recognize the constraints of sources, to insist on survivor dignity, and to let the surviving marks, wall scratches, frescoes, inscriptions, stand as human presences who outlived attempts to silence them. Final reflection. Names and memory. Imagine standing in a low, cool room, the stone underfoot damp with centuries, your light catching on a scratch, a name. The hand that made that letter may have trembled with fear, anger, defiance, or simply the private need to leave a sign that one had existed and witnessed. The name is small. It is not a verdict. It is a memory. For centuries, official histories left these small marks out of the narrative. For centuries, scholarship focused on grand events and men in public life. Now, as archaeologists and historians gather these shards, they help us recover voices that once were marginalized. The ritual, if we can call it that without erasing the human cost, remains disturbing. It reveals how religion and law can conspire to protect certain actions, how silence can be legislated, and how the poor and the vulnerable often pay the price for institutional protection. If this history surprised you, subscribe for more investigations into buried and silent stories, and leave a comment. Whose names would you want to find on a wall? Think too about the deeper question it raises for us today. What traditions do we accept without asking who they protect and who they expose? Researcher note for verification. Several names and spellings cited in older excavation reports and transcriptions are contested in the literature, e.g. ritual names Deditus or Daditus Devorum, literary references to Plotus, Serranus, Juvenal.
Please verify primary epigraphic readings and bibliographic details before final publication.